Welcome everybody to the first webinar of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. It's really a pleasure to have you with us tonight. This is the first session after the summer break, and it is the start of the fall 2021 session. Today we're very honored to have with us Lene Wendland. Lene, her title of her webinar is 10 years of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The session will provide an overview of the background and key concepts of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We'll discuss why they matter for business and perhaps for all of us. We couldn't have better than Lene to talk about this. She is the chief of the Business and Human Rights Unit in the UN Human Rights. She was part of the team of a former special representative of the UN Secretary General on Business and Human Rights, Professor John Ruggie, and contributed to the development and drafting of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Lene directs the UN Human Rights Accountability and Remedy Project, which aims to enhance accountability and access to remedy in cases of business involvement in human rights abuses. She also directs the UN Human Rights BTEC project, applying the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights to key human rights challenges related to digital technologies. Lene was a member of the FIFA Independent Human Rights Advisory Board between 2017 and 2020 of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Human Rights 2020-2022 and the Advisory Council of the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights. She represents UN Human Rights in the Governance Committee of the Center for Sports and Human Rights and as a technical advisor to the board of the International COCO Initiative. Without much ado, Lene, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and the floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you very much, Ali, for this kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I will now just try to get my slides starting. We were just talking about it. Here we go. Yeah, so it's my great pleasure to speak to you this evening. This is you come from a country, from a region that we don't engage with enough on the business and human rights work from the UN Human Rights Office. So it's really is a great pleasure and an opportunity for me to engage with all of you. So as Ali was saying in his introduction, I will focus on talking about business and human rights. What is it? Why? What are human rights even? Why does it matter? Why does it matter for companies? Why is this something that is relevant for business? Why should they pay attention? And I will also say a few words about who in the UN system is working on these issues, including at the national level. So when I give this kind of introductory presentation to business and human rights, I always think it's helpful to go back and remind ourselves what are we talking about when we're talking about human rights, because it's not a concept that maybe many of you come across or think about in your day-to-day business. So I think it's important just to make it as simple as possible when we discuss business and human rights, to think about what is it? Why is this something we need to care about? And just at its very core, I mean, outside of treaties and conventions and you know, all the discussions that one has about these issues, the simple idea really is that everyone should be treated with dignity. That is at the core of human rights. When one strip off all the legalities and all the sort of highfalutin language, it's about really the right of everyone having an inherent right to be treated with dignity without discrimination. So this basic fundamental idea has been enshrined in international treaties and in customary law that have been signed and adhered to by states. So this is really at the core of the idea. It's about all of us, every one of you and myself and the people we meet and the people that are around us, our right to dignity. But human rights as a legal concept have been formulated in treaties that are binding on states. So the modern concept of human rights, this idea that dignity and non-discrimination is at the heart of human rights, really was set in first of all, or was first developed in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And I need to get rid of this heading because this was when we celebrated the 70th anniversary, which is now a few years ago. But in 1948, the world came together in the aftermath of the Second World War, where there had obviously been incredible abuses and atrocities committed by states against individuals, against groups of people. So it was imperative for the world in the aftermath of the Second World War to come together to start again, to declare these fundamental rights that were inherent on people, directed at where states undertook to protect rights. But so one of the drafters of the Universal Declaration was Eleanor Roosevelt, and there's a quote from her that I also think is really important to keep in mind, also when we're talking human rights generally, but also when we're talking business and human rights, that human rights, where do they belong? They belong to every individual, but where should they matter? Where do they begin? And I love this phrase, in small places close to home. So it's where we live, it's where we work, it's where we are educated, it's in the office where we work. And as this quote is saying, unless the rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. So again, just bringing down the concept of human rights to things that matter in the small places close to home. It also matters in the bigger, broader societal impact, but really at its core, it is about something that has to be enjoyed as we all go about our day-to-day business in universities and schools, in the places we work. So going on, fast forwarding to the guiding principles and where they came from. So human rights, as I just mentioned, grew out of the Second World War. They grew out of a notion that states have duties vis-a-vis people, vis-a-vis individuals. And states were what we call technically the duty bearers, the ones that had duties in relation to upholding human rights of people. That's how the international human rights system was designed, addressed to states. States were the owners, so to speak, of the system. But since 1948, and a number of subsequent human rights treaties were developed, but it became increasingly clear that states weren't always doing what they undertook to do under these human rights treaties. And there was also, starting particularly with the globalization in the 1970s and 80s, where you would have increased international financial flows, you would have outsourcing of production to countries in other parts of the world than had traditionally been centers of production. And that posed challenges as well to that model of human rights as something that states control within their national boundaries, because when both finance and production cross boundaries, then this model of states to be the upholder of human rights came under challenge, as well as the very clear recognition that states were not always willing or able to uphold the human rights obligations that it undertook. So increasingly with globalization and with increased economic activity and production, attention started focusing to the human rights challenges that would take place in the context of economic activity. So that could be mines, it could be garment factories that were accused of or had child labor employed, or where workers were not paid their salaries, or where other kinds of abuses were taking place. So the human rights community was turning its attention to the fact that companies can abuse human rights, can have an adverse impact on human rights, as well as a positive impact by creating jobs, etc. And maybe when states were not doing their job under the international human rights legal system, maybe that meant that companies should have the same duties and obligations as states where they were abusing rights. So it came to a head in the 1990s, where there was a real big pressure on companies, that civil society communities where companies were operating were increasingly asked and expected to deliver on human rights when states were failing. And states, for their part, were saying, well, hang on, human rights, that's for us, it's our responsibility, and we will look after we will set the legal and other parameters for companies. But it was an unsustainable situation. It was as if there was a gap in the international human rights system, because there was, again, the architecture was focused on states' duties and states doing their jobs. But increasingly, we had these non-state actors, these companies, who had increasingly many cases of where the activities were causing harm to human rights. So the international human rights system, the UN Human Rights Commission, as it was at the time, came to a decision that something needed to be resolved. There was a problem in the international human rights architecture that needed fixing. And they decided to outsource the problem. They appointed Professor John Ruggie as the special representative to try to come up with a new framework for how to think about human rights when it comes to business enterprises. So expanding the human rights framework for being not only about states, but also clarifying what are the responsibilities of these non-state actors that can have a huge impact on human rights, both positively, but also negatively. So John Ruggie led the process for 6 years under successive mandates of the UN Human Rights Council, as it had become at the time, with saying, go and sort out, fill this gap, come up with a proposal that can fill the gap in the international human rights system. And to make this long 6-year process short, in 2011, John Ruggie presented to the Human Rights Council this new framework, the global normative framework, the UN, that became known as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, based on a 6-year process with enormous amount of consultation, research, and engagement, both at the national level, at the international level, engagement with business organizations, with individual companies, with financial sector companies, with governments, with civil society organizations, with trade unions. And so in 2011, this piece of work was presented to the Human Rights Council, who unanimously endorsed the guiding principles. And I've sort of gone over the process and the history rather quickly, because I don't have so much time this evening. But it's important to just recall that in the 1990s and 80s and 90s, this was a very polarized debate. As I said, the civil society were calling on, advocating for human rights duties on companies. States were saying, oh, you stay out of it, we'll look after it. And business, for their side, said, well, we have no responsibilities. The only responsibility we have is to respect national law where we operate. And if there are no national laws, or if they're not enforced, that's really not our problem, because the human rights is a matter for governments. So very, very polarized. So the fact that in 2011, there was unanimous endorsement, not just amongst governments, but also the guiding principles was supported by all the global business organizations, all the global trade union confederations, as well as large parts of civil society, was really a milestone in the international human rights discourse, that after all these years and decades of tension and depolarization, that at least now there was a shared agreement, not just among states, but also for business representatives and for civil society actors. What are the basic expectations, the basic responsibilities that business have with regard to human rights, but also, as I'll come to in a minute, what does that mean for states? What role do they still have? So really the 2011 was this milestone, and we had just celebrated in June the 10th anniversary, and I'll get back to that in a minute. So the guiding principles comprises what we call 3 pillars. And the first one is keeping states firmly in the picture, because we can't only, when it comes to human rights, states still have to play their role. States are the ones who regulate, they're the ones who provide policy incentives, they are governments, they need to govern, including when it comes to how the parameters around which, or within which business has to operate. So the first pillar, the state duty to protect, repeated, reinforced, reiterated the duties that states already have under human rights law that again was addressed to them and supported and adhered to, or rather adopted by states, reminding states that their core duties when it comes to business activities is to have appropriate policies and regulation, and also adjudication where there has been harm caused by business. The second pillar is the one that is directly addressed to business enterprises. So in a sense, that was the real innovation of the guiding principles, that filling of that gap, as I mentioned earlier, that sets out what is the standard of responsibility that business have, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, which is defined in the guiding principles as a responsibility to act with due diligence to avoid infringing on the rights of others, and to address adverse human rights impacts where they happen. So as a distinct but complementary responsibility, standard of responsibility that companies have, irrespective of whether states are meeting their duties. And that's an important point as well to emphasize, that the corporate responsibility doesn't depend on whether states are living up to its foundations. It exists independently of what states are doing. But of course, it's much easier for a company to operate with respect for human rights if there are appropriate regulatory and policy frameworks that guide how the company can and do that. So the third pillar, and they're each important, is about the people. It's about the people who are impacted. The duty to protect of states is about protecting against harm to people. The corporate responsibility to respect human rights is also about the company taking all reasonable steps, acting with due diligence to avoid causing harm to people. But sometimes harm do happen, whatever preventative measures have been in place. And those who have been the victims of business-related human rights abuse, the guiding principles stipulate have a right to an effective remedy through either judicial or non-judicial grievance mechanisms. So if you imagine a three-legged chair, a three-legged stool, there is the state and the company and the people who might be impacted. And each, when you're talking business and human rights, we need to keep in mind all of them. It's not enough only to focus on the company. It's not enough only to focus on the state. It's not enough only to focus on the rights of people. It really, in order to ensure that rights are respected and protected, and victims have access to grievance mechanisms to remedy, you really need to look at all three pillars in order to achieve the intended result that was promised in the guiding principles. So we now have the framework. We have a clear understanding of what companies need to do. to respect human rights. In some places, there will be national laws that require companies to do it. Other places there won't be. But as I said, companies are expected to do the right thing anyway. But there's also a big question around law and expectations aside. Why is this a good idea? Why should companies respect human rights? Aside from what we, other reasons, it's just the business. What is the business case? And the business case depends a lot on what company we're talking about, where it operates, what is the sector. Is it an area where there might be conflicts? Is it a company that has big physical footprint, where they can be subject to community protest? Is it a company that has investors that are asking them questions about this? So the business case may vary, but generally, we, in the work that we've been doing over the last 10 years in our engagement with companies, can see that for many companies, there are just some similarities. And first of all, it is the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. It is the not doing harm to others is a very fundamental sentiment. It's a fundamental core of going back to the Universal Declaration on human rights. Understanding and managing the impacts a company has on people and the communities, and not infringing on basic human dignity, is at the core of what human rights are, and it is what the basic expectation is the right thing to do. But it's also, there can be a very strong risk management dimension to why companies should respect human rights. Again, depending on where you operate and what sector you're in, a company can face quite significant operational risks. So if, for example, you operate a mine and the community is getting so unhappy with how you are, maybe you're polluting their water source or their fields, or around cutting off their access to food. Maybe your security guards are not treating people, and in some cases might even do harm and violence to people. Your operations can be significantly hampered if you don't manage effectively your relationships with your community. But you can also increasingly face legal risks. It could either be through international litigation, or where there are legal frameworks, legal course of actions that relate to human rights. Laws might not come with the title of human rights, but address issues, cover issues that are related to human rights. Or financial risks, if you are investors don't want to give you access to capital because of a human rights conflict, a human rights issue that has hit the headlines, and they don't want to be part of it. So human rights management, human rights risk management is, in many cases, can be and should be and is a core element of good risk management systems in a well-run company, to avoid what are human rights risks turning into also risk to the company itself. Respecting rights is again, it goes to the right thing to do. It's related that it's a near universal expectation. The guiding principles, pillar 2, the one that is addressed to companies, it reflects a number of soft law instruments. It reflects a number of civil society expectations, but it also reflects commitments that companies are already making or have already made under, for example, committing to the UN Global Compact, or any other of these commitments or expectations or soft law instruments. We looked carefully at that when we were developing the guiding principles to see what is actually the standard of expectation, and respecting rights, not doing harm to people, was something that companies are just expected to do, and that went across geographies, across sectors, and across stakeholders. It's beyond respecting human rights is not just about not doing harm. You can maximize the positive contribution to society if you respect human rights. So for example, a company that has a supply chain where if they say, well, we are ensuring that we are doing our bit to ensure that labor rights are respected, that there's gender equality, that all the sort of different human rights, living wage, non-discrimination, thereby you're not only not doing harm by ensuring that you're managing those risks, but you're also actively contributing to the societies in which your operations or products are linked. And it can be very costly to get it wrong. That when we were looking at this, and there are many more recent examples, but just the one really at the time the guiding principles was developed was an example that we found that was developed by Goldman Sachs. So it wasn't exactly a human rights activist paper, but Goldman Sachs had done a study of their extractive company clients, and found that one company, I mean, they found a number of things, but the one number that stood out was that a single extractive company could have lost up to or more than $6.5 billion over a 2-year period from community-related project delays. And community-related project delays are often proxies for underlying human rights concerns. And the worst part was the company didn't even really realize that that was why they were losing this amount of money, because they didn't have any systems in place to track it. So again, other examples, this can be very, very expensive, not for all companies, but for a number of companies, it can be very expensive not to ensure that you manage your human rights risk, that you're managing the risk you have to people. So there are a number of trends in the last 10 years since as I said, there was unanimous endorsement, very strong support, but of course, as John Ruggie himself said when he presented the guiding principles, the endorsement, having the guiding principles was just the end of the beginning. And now the whole issue around implementation and uptake would have to start. And that's what we've been seeing happening over the last 10 years. So what have been the trends? We've seen the regulatory landscape evolving. The guiding principles pillar 1, this one about states, calls on states to adopt a smart mix of measures, so both mandatory and voluntary measures that for companies, and that we have seen increasingly in a number of countries, particularly in Europe, but increasingly also outside of Europe, countries considering mandating elements of human rights due diligence, where the human rights due diligence process that I didn't get into for interest of time, but is the process through which a company meets its responsibility to respect. So assessing what your impact is and taking the necessary steps. There is a plan for European Union-wide regulation mandating human rights due diligence, which means that not only European companies, but any company who wants to trade or sell in the European market would be subject to mandatory human rights due diligence in one form or another. So that's a very strong trend, particularly in the last couple of years. There's also a trend towards increased transparency expectations. Stakeholders are increasingly expected transparency from companies. There are a number of civil society organizations that are running benchmarks, tracking company disclosures on the understanding that if we're not just going to take the company's word for it when they say, well, we're doing okay, we're doing what we're meant to be doing. How do they report on that in a way that is credible and in a way that the wider society can check and hold the company to account through whatever means, if it's overstating the effectiveness of its actions. There's also an increasing trend, like everything is increasingly, or a lot is increasingly about climate change, and including connecting the role of business to both accountability for adverse human rights impact resulting from climate change, but also, of course, the positive role that we need companies to play if we are going to address the climate emergency. And then finally, and this is just a very short list of trends, but the ones that have been more notable, like anywhere in society, the impact of technology companies. That is a particular focus also for a piece of work that we are leading from the UN Human Rights Office, but we're linking and increasing focus on what are the human rights responsibilities of tech companies, and what does effective tech regulation and policies look like in order to ensure that activities, the products of the tech sector doesn't pose risks to people, doesn't pose societal risks, while realizing the positive contributions that tech can have. So from our side, so the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, so we work in the space, we work on doing dissemination, supporting implementation of the guiding principles, outreach like doing this kind of presentation. We are also working within the UN system to have any part of the UN system policies and activities that relate to business activities that have a positive reflection of the guiding principles in terms of what are the core expectations that companies do, for example, in UN procurement rules. We are in a process where we are trying to align UN procurement, including UN procurement of technology, in a manner that is aligned with the expectations of the UN guiding principles. We do increasingly support business and human rights at the country level. We, just from our office, we have offices, I think, in about 87 countries around the world, and we are increasingly engaging with stakeholders at the national level, be it companies, civil society, or others, to do business and human rights work at the country level. We also have, as part of the UN human rights system, we have a group of independent experts, working group on business and human rights, that have been appointed by the UN Human Rights Council. So in addition to the UN Human Rights Office, we have this group of independent experts with a mandate from governments in the Human Rights Council to work on business and human rights, and they also work on promoting the dissemination and implementation of the UN guiding principles. And they have a wide mandate, and I don't have, we collaborate, our office provides secretariat support, but on the substantive level, we have a wide range of overlap and complementarity, rather, and collaboration that is happening across a number of activities, both at the international level and at the national level. So just more specifically on collaboration, and I know I'm running short of time now, so I'll maybe just focus on our collaboration with the UN Global Compact. So that's the UN's UN-wide initiative for corporate responsibility, including on human rights. We have the UN Human Rights Office is one of the 4 guardian agencies, we call it, because they are of the Global Compact. There are 10 principles, and 2 of them are on human rights. So since the UN Global Compact was launched in the year 2000, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have had a particular role to support, provide strategic high-level support to the direction of the UN Global Compact. We also have a very extensive collaboration with Global Compact local networks at the country level. So I mentioned we are increasingly working at the country level, and as far as engagement and involvement directly with companies at the country level, the Global Compact local networks in many places, not in all places, but in many places, is an excellent partner, because they are the ones who have the direct contact with the companies. And then we also co-chair what's called the Global Compact Expert Network, which is more on sort of some of the thematic work streams and activities that produce guidance materials and resources for companies that are participating in the Global Compact. We do work with the ILO. We have a big project, particularly in Latin America, to do country-level activities and the interface between business and human rights and international labor standards. We also work closely with the OECD. The OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises has a human rights chapter that is cut and paste from the guiding principles. So because we have such a strong normative overlap, it makes sense that we try to align our activities and our approaches with the OECD and the various bodies. And of course, there are a number of countries outside of OECD members who adheres to the OECD guidelines. So it is really an increasingly global reach that we can have through collaboration with the OECD. So the 10th anniversary, that was a project launched by the working group. So this group of 5 experts that you saw the nice pictures of a little bit earlier. And they have a big project, the UNGPs plus 10. So both taking stock on what has been achieved in the last 10 years. And they published a report to the Human Rights Council in June on the occasion of the 10th anniversary, just having consulted and received input, what has happened, what have we achieved in the next 10 years. And at the moment, they're very busy working on a roadmap for implementation over the next 10 years. So the UNGPs plus 10 plus, and that will be launched probably around November this year. And that will sort of, based on input and what has been achieved, looking through what are the key advances that we need to or want to make in the coming years, because obviously a lot has happened in the past 10 years, but a huge amount still needs to be happening, including reaching many more companies, having much better uptake also from governments in being aware of their human rights duties when it comes to the interface with companies. So sorry for going a bit longer, but I will leave it at that, and then we have some Q&A, and I look forward to your comments or your questions.
Thank you, Lene. Thanks. I have few comments. All of a sudden, we as a Gerhard Center, we've been attending the business and human rights, the November meeting at Geneva for the last 4 or 5 years. And interesting enough, all of a sudden, in the last 2-3 years, it's all over the place. I mean, you turn on CNN, and they have this thing called the Freedom Project. And then you see Siddhartha Kar talking about modern day slavery and trafficking and conflict minerals. You have this guy, Justin Dillon, he's talking about supply chain software that gives you the risk of your supply chain from a human rights perspective. So it's all over the place, even to the extent, I mean, we invited Jeffrey Sachs last year, almost around more than a year from now. And one of his comments that would really ring a bell to me was, he was saying that it's about time we should view the SDGs from a perspective of human rights. So it's very interesting. Now, the problem with human rights violations, especially in value chains, it's never first tier. It's never in the boundaries of a company. They always hide it in second or third or fourth tier. And look at, for example, apparel companies. They are notorious in outsourcing and subcontracting. And it's never at the first large subcontractor. It's always hidden. So you really have to have someone who is really expert in value chain or supply chain audit to unravel this. This cannot be a lawyer. I mean, it really has to be somebody who is really expert, field expertise in value chain audit. Now, so one comment, and then I'll pass it to you to sort of, I was talking to a Dutch guy, and they have like an aggregate of business communities, business companies, and they try to sort of promote responsible trade. And I was telling him about that companies usually bury violations in their value chains in the second or the third or the fourth tier. And the guy was telling me, interestingly, I mean, companies are no more interested in burying violations anymore, because guess what? Eventually, they blow up in your face. I still think that you need I mean, you cannot rely. I mean, even in regular human beings, you cannot rely on the goodwill of human beings. You still need regulations. You still need laws to enforce it. You still need civil society pressure. But do you think you really are companies really? I mean, you're seeing this trend that they are now more interested in burying their violation in the value chain?
Thank you, Ali. I mean, it's some great questions, and I just taking that it's everywhere. One of what you're alluding to, the annual forum on business and human rights, which has been going on for the last 10 years. It was established after the endorsement of the guiding principles, and that has become the largest global gathering. We had at the last, before COVID, we had about 3,000 participants coming to Geneva for 3 days to discuss business and human rights. And there were 25% companies, and then governments, stakeholders, other experts. So it's really, I think, a sign of what the other things you were mentioning about the Freedom Project and the modern day slavery, that there is an increasing understanding that there's so many issues that belongs under the umbrella of business and human rights. And it's better to look at them, I mean, in a sort of under a coherent, within a coherent framework, because otherwise it becomes very ad hoc. You do something on modern slavery here, or we do something on conflict minerals there, but it needs to be underpinned by the same kind of rules and expectations. And by the way, the conflict minerals, the guiding principles was very much informed by the OECD conflict minerals due diligence that had been developed in the 1990s. So I think that and you open your newspaper, you read about Pegasus spyware, you read about, it's all relevant from a business and human rights perspective. And it's, on the one hand, we say let 1,000 flowers bloom, but having these discussions that are where the same standards and expectations can inform, because it's only by speaking about the same thing applied in different contexts that you can actually make progress, because otherwise it becomes very discrete and very ad hoc to address a particular problem over here, but problems pop up elsewhere. So I think it's super positive that there are all these initiatives, and it's even more positive if it can be sort of grounded in a common set of understanding of what are the core expectations of companies. That also goes to your point about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which we see as integral to needing as a company, and many companies have really embraced the SDGs. And we're saying that is fantastic, but you can only really, your greatest contribution to the SDGs is if you proactively ensure that you respect human rights through your value chain. Because in that way, the SDGs doesn't become a little pet project of the CEO or something that sounds good, but is really unrelated to your core business or where you can make the greatest contribution. It is through your value chain, through the human rights and development issues that you touch upon. So embedding respect for human rights across your activities is indeed the greatest contribution that business can play individually and collectively to the SDGs. The agendas are intimately linked. And that also picks up on your point about the first tier, the guiding principles, and it's such an important point that if you just look at the first tier, even second tier, even third tier, it can look okay. And companies say, well, we're doing okay because we put it in our contract with our supplier that they had to behave nicely. But when we know, and the company knows, that actually the problem isn't what goes into that contract, if the contract hasn't anticipated the very real issue of subcontracting through all these tiers in the supply chain. And the guiding principle says your responsibility extends through your value chain. So it's not only limited, your responsibility doesn't stop at the door of your first tier supplier. And when you do your human rights due diligence, when you do your impact assessment, you need to understand where, if there is a high risk sector, you know that in apparel, for example, in certain countries, the subcontracting way down, there's a lot of, maybe at the bottom of that supply chain, there's homework women typically sits, and where women sits and sews, there will often be not proper payment, and there will often be children around who will be called in to do some of the finer work. That doesn't require a huge amount of human rights expertise to identify these issues. They're well known, they're well documented. And the guiding principle says, if you're going to use that supplier, you need to understand that, and you need to work either directly or with others in the sector, because many of these issues are systemic issues. It goes beyond the ability of an individual company maybe to address the issue, but how do you build leverage to try to change some of these systemic issues that are related to your production, to your products and services? And again, the due diligence process anticipates that. So again, it's not about sending in an auditor to the first tier, or even having an army of human rights experts. It's about making connections, speaking to stakeholders that understand where the risks are, and then working collectively with stakeholders to try to address these challenges. The last point you made, and sorry to take a bit long, risk of identifying that tension between the guiding principles expect companies to go out and find problems and communicate how they're dealing with them. At the same time, and increasing regulations are coming in, companies say, well, actually, the less we know, the better, because otherwise we might be subject to some kind of legal sanction. And there is a very real tension between the two. What is the legal liability framework, and what are the expectations of the guiding principles? And we think that the guiding principles and as a standard of conduct, what is reasonable, that needs to be incorporated in regulatory framework, not as an excuse for companies, or we'll just take your word for it, but having qualitative indicators for what is generally a process of identifying and addressing problems that somehow needs to fit in when it comes to the determinations of legal liability.
Lovely. I have just one comment, and then I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. I just want to make sure that the participants understand when we talk about human rights violation because of business, this is not just sub-Saharan Africa or developing countries. There are very interesting examples of violation that happens within Europe against, for example, harvest collectors from East Europe or truck drivers from East Europe. There are clear business human rights violations in such a thing. Another interesting example, which people would never imagine it, are cruise liners, ships, cruise liner. A cruise liner above the sea level is a very different world, including the captain and the assistants and the top tier of the workforce, versus what's underneath the sea level. Underneath the sea level, it's 100% outright borderline modern day slavery. The way they treat them, even the salary, even the work shifts, instead of an 8 hour, all of a sudden it's 12 hours. So there are those kind of violations, even in what you would tend to assume are safe, lovely, interesting, advanced, recreational, that kind of a thing. So anyway, I'm gonna, do you have any comments about this before I start taking?
Just said I couldn't agree more, that this is not there is no one who has got this right. If we look at some of the supply chains that are within Europe, you mentioned the harvester, often undocumented migrant workers who are treated in appalling conditions without any rights. We did actually, and COVID has exacerbated a number of these risks. The seafarers, the right of seafarers, we did a tool for shipping companies and those who are to ensure that they that the decisions they are making from their corporate headquarters in London or Berlin or wherever, that the impact is understood, whether it be impact within Europe or for example, when it comes to shipping outside of the national boundaries. So this is really not an agenda that any region or country in the world can feel that they are totally on top.
I was talking, by the way, about cruise ships.
Yeah. No, that too. Yeah.
Cruise ships, not even shipping liners.
Yeah. Yeah, no, cruise ships, I mean, luxury hotels in Western capitals. There's certainly some of the cleaners there that are not always right. I mean, just as an anecdote, some years ago, a big international UK bank did a human rights impact assessment of where their greatest risks are. And they found, and it was a good good quality impact assessment, that the greatest human rights risk that they had was to their janitorial staff who were cleaning their offices in the Docklands in London every night, because they were the ones who worked without a proper contract, without et cetera, et cetera. So, there's no one who have anything to lord over the other when it comes to these issues.
Okay, I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. I have 3 hands that I can see: Sherwet, Vinet, and Firas. So I'm going to start in that order. Sherwet, please unmute yourself and feel free if you want to turn on your videos, please.
Hi, hello, thank you. Thank you, Lene, for being with us. Very, nice to have you. I'm associate professor of operations and supply chain management, a colleague of Dr. Ali. So I'm very familiar with the supply chain issues you mentioned, and it's a very, I have to say, practical and helpful lens that we've been using to discuss and talk about human rights for quite a while. But you did mention the initial stance of the group was to deal with states, and then suddenly you shifted towards the businesses. My concern is there something that might have fell between the cracks, as they would call it, in that transition, because self-reporting, focusing on buying firms, responsibility in supply chains to report or to do business with those who would agree with their principles is on one hand, but still there's a lot to be done at the state level that I think your group could help. In follow-up to this question, also the fact that post-COVID now and the job losses happening, we all, I think, expect a new report coming out 2021. How, let's all face it, with job losses and pressure to people closing businesses, having a job is going to suppress a lot of the gained successes we reported in the past few years on human rights. So any comments on either issue?
Did you want to take? Do you want me to respond now, or do you want to take the other questions as well?
It's up to you. You can respond one at a time. It makes it easier.
Okay, so no, absolutely, Shabbat. It's a good question, and I couldn't agree more that it's not only about saying to companies, now you must self-report. That's why there are 3 pillars in the UN Guiding Principles, and then the duty of states have to at all times be kept, because it's not one or the other. We can't say, well, states now are off the hook because now all the attention is on the companies. It really is that the state role to ensure that there are effective policies and regulation in place to require and demand reporting, for example, when it's high risk activities, having more rigorous reporting initiatives. It's not just enough to publish a sustainability report on the website once a year that looks all glossy and nice, but doesn't actually get to the heart of the matter. So, I mean, the interrelationship between the pillars of the guiding principles was exactly intended to guard against that falling between the cracks, that we looking only at companies or and less at states. So really in order for this to be successful and to be, realize the promise of the guiding principles, you do need to have states there taking up and meeting their governing functions when it comes to protecting people against harm from corporations. It's like a hamburger, really, that you have the underbun is the state sort of regulatory function, and then you have the access to remedy on top, and then in the middle you have the corporate responsibility to respect, and they really work better if you have all 3. So on the impact of COVID, I think it has been devastating how what the impact on human rights from COVID, including in supply chains, and we, the High Commissioner, alongside the Secretary General of the UN and others, have really implored and deplored how many companies have just cut off their suppliers, saying, because now we are not going to sell ours. So even if they had commissioned production, they would just say, well, we drop the contract and we're not going to pay you, leaving a lot of very vulnerable workers along that supply chain. So that is we've issued guidance to companies on how they should meet the responsibility to respect in the context of COVID, and there is an increasing amount of resources available. But that really has been it has been quite devastating, and not all companies have stepped up in this crisis.
Vinet, would you please unmute yourself, sir? And also you could start your video if you want. Hello? Vinet? Okay. We'll skip to Firas. Okay. And then we'll go back to Vinet. Hopefully, Firas, would you unmute and start your video, please?
Oh, yes. Hello. First of all, thank you, Ms. Wendland, for being here. It's an honor for me to attend this webinar. I would just like to add something because so I come from Yemen, and Yemen is a country that is notorious for a wide range of human rights violations there. And I just wanted to bring up the light that in a country like Yemen, I don't know if it happens in other places, in other countries, but I think that human rights violations within a workplace, within the labor, doesn't only happen in blue collar context, but also in white collar. Like I heard that there are banks that hire financial analysts that are only high school graduates. They don't hire university graduates, people who have a diploma or anything, just high school graduates. So they say that, okay, we can train them and they can do one thing that we told them to, and they put them in very horrible working conditions, working long hours, and they give them a title like a manager. And I think that legally, if someone is titled as a manager, they're not eligible. They're exempt from overtime pay, and they let them work for 12 hours, 13, 14 hours a day. And I don't know, like I just don't see enough light being shed on the issue of human rights violations on white collar employees. So I don't really know what could be done about this, but I would really appreciate if I could know your insight about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Firas. And you're probably right that there isn't enough attention paid to white collar, because it's certainly, I mean, one can say certainly as a matter of principle, the guiding principles in human rights apply also to those who are white collar workers. It's not something that is exempt. It's a right that everyone has. It is true that there has been more attention to blue collar through the lens in human rights. There's a particular focus on people at heightened risk of vulnerabilities, and that tends to be those in more precarious jobs, maybe those who are at risk of discrimination on any ground, gender or ethnic or on religious grounds. So and one tends to forget about the white collar workers on the assumption, which might well in many cases not be true, that there's less vulnerability. If you're white collar, you tend to have more education, you tend to have maybe more agency, that you can leave. But as you're saying, white collar can also be those who are not necessarily highly educated and don't have a lot of agency. So again, I'm not sure I can shed a lot of light other than to reemphasize that human rights apply to everybody, including white collar workers. And it's a fair point that in certain sectors, there's been maybe insufficient or quite selective focus. So for example, in the financial sector, in a number of countries, that there's been a lot of attention to gender discrimination. So the fact that women are not able to or not advancing their unequal pay for equal work, etc. But it's true that it's sort of tend to be selective around specific themes. But thank you for raising that.
Vinet, are you ready?
Yes.
Can you unmute? You can turn your video on if you want also. Please.
Yeah. It was wonderful listening to you, Lane. And my basic question was regarding, the rise of consumption boom, because of this globalization, which we are seeing, and because of which, there's a lot of focus right now on, basically, profits and capital, and basically a lot of manufacturing activity and everything is getting shifted to, these developing countries like China and Vietnam, etc. And because of which, the labor rights and everything is getting eroded, and the large corporates are basically more focused towards, creating the asset bubble, or for that matter, they are more focused towards evading taxes, money laundering, or for example, even for that matter, distorting labor, towards, capital. So the capital labor ratio is getting distorted because of this, the environment, and a lot of, sustainable goals, sustainability and everything is getting, completely, a lot of greenwashing is taking there, and this green sustainability goals are not being, put into, plan or put into practice. So what can be done to, so that, the profits and basically these things can be, better be, equitably be distributed, and this thing is getting much more, magnified after this pandemic. As you can see, billionaires are getting much more, able to get much more, government aided, support, as far as, and the workers, and they are basically not able to, reach their even, basic minimum requirements because of this, these cut in salaries, cut in wages, everything, workers, etc. So how can this thing, and this thing is going to get much more magnified after this, with this automation, robotics, everything, getting, much more put into practice by these large players, So this is going to be some kind of an issue that a lot of these, big these policymakers will have to, deal with, in the near future to bring some kind of, parity. So can you shed some light on that? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, a number of the themes that you touch upon obviously are related to, it goes beyond the business and human rights, and it's related to global governance. How does the world organize itself? How can one collaborate around to ensure that there is not base erosion and tax evasion, etc. And the guiding principles in the business and human rights plays some role in that, but many of the policy discussions need to be resolved sort of in sort of global policy, global governance fora that are dedicated. And from our perspective, we're saying, well, human rights needs to be part of those discussions. So, for example, at the OECD, there is the discussion around increasing the minimum tax and ensuring that you can't just do, the profit shifting in order to be incorporated in a jurisdiction that is, no tax and have no transparency. A number of these issues, I must confess, is beyond my particular area of expertise, but they are really important in order to reset the sort of global governance frameworks, including around how economic actors are acting and can be held accountable and can be, taking its proper role in society and ensuring positive contributions. But the roadmap that I mentioned that the working group on business and human rights is currently developing on what is in store, what do we need to focus on in the next 10 years, will cover, most likely point to a number of the themes that you highlighted, and get with recommendations on, not with solutions, because there's no single easy solution to any of these very global challenges, but setting how can one ensure that the business and human rights component, the human rights component, is integrated and at the core of many of these discussions. So I'm not sure I can get it much closer or add a lot more wisdom, but it's thank you for raising some of these global challenges, systemic issues that really does require a sustained effort at the level of global governance in order to be resolved.
I'm muted. Sorry. It's 8:05. Can we take another 5 minutes just to take a question and wrap up? That's going to be the last question. Is that okay? Okay. Mariam, please unmute. You can turn on your video if you want and ask your question. Mariam? Interesting. Well, okay, I guess. Well, let's wrap up, I think. I mean, Mariam, if you, okay, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I hope you hear me now, so?
Yes, you can hear you. Yes, please ask your question.
Thank you so much for this webinar. Actually, it was very informative and exciting, so thank you. And yeah, I want to just put emphasis on important two examples. The first one is related to the big holding companies or big manufacturers that are causing damage to the climate, or they cause environmental catastrophes due to the gases or carbon dioxides that are affecting even the ozone layers and the climate around us. And the second example is related to the trade of mercenaries and the business companies that are holding some mercenaries and sending them to countries in conflicts, like the Middle Eastern countries and so on. So concerning those two issues and two examples, what do you recommend that the United Nations can do, and what are the coercive measures that could be taken to prevent the climate damage or the catastrophe caused by carbon dioxides or gases of big machineries and big manufacturers? And what are the coercive measures that the United Nations could enforce or implement in order to remove this mercenary trade, or sending mercenaries to some conflict countries by some companies that are really making some cooperatives with the armed forces of some countries entering conflicts in Middle East?
Thank you. I can't really speak on behalf of the UN writ large in response to some of these issues from a business and human rights perspective. When it comes to the environmental harm, as I was mentioning in my presentation, particularly on the climate change agenda, but also on the wider environmental, there is a strong link between increasing recognition of the linkages between human rights violations and environmental degradation. And so, for example, the initiative in the European Union to have mandatory due diligence regulation is in fact for companies to have mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. So being able to, as you are a company, being able to, or being required to identify and prevent and mitigate what risks you're posing, not only on human rights, but also on environmental actors. So I think that the increasing connection that companies need to identify and be held account for the adverse impacts on both on the environment and on human rights that are related to environmental degradation is something that I think will be an important contribution to addressing the individual company impact in this context. And then there is the sort of broader, regulation on toxics, etc. And that's beyond my remit to talk about. But certainly from the business and human rights perspective, that is a connection that is there is an increasing focus on and recognition of those interlinkages. When it comes to mercenaries, again, there are a number of issues that is beyond what I'm competent to talk about, but certainly from the guiding principles perspective, I mean, those companies that private military and security companies, they are subject to the UN guiding principles, and there's a number of initiatives and codes of conduct, the Montreux principles, that are specifically developed to and working with a number of the companies to try and address the human rights risks that go into that arise from private military and security companies. There's also in the UN human rights system, there is a process to possibly develop some kind of instrument, legally binding instrument, a treaty that addresses specifically the human rights impact on arising from the use and deployment of private military security companies. So it's an issue that is underway. We have the framework, again, the UN Guiding Principles apply to these companies. They are not always easy to engage, and of course the regulation around that particular sector can be is challenging, but it is something that is on the agenda. Thank you.
This was the first webinar of the fall 2021 after a long summer hiatus. I think you had a good start, and really thank you, Lynn, for your great contribution here. In the fall, we will have a webinar about built environment, human rights in built environment, and modern day slavery. Be with us next Wednesday. Our guest will be William Burkert. He's the president of the Investment Integration Project, and he will talk about the topic of his recent book, 21st Century Investing, Redirecting Financial Strategies to Drive Systems Change. Please be with us, same time next week. Thank you, Lena. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Thank
you
you
for having
everybody
me.
for attending.
Thanks.